I've been tearing things down for 26 years. That's what I do, all I do, and I wouldn't have it any other way. My demolition outfit sits just outside of Hammond, Indiana. It's a one-man operation on paper. I quote, hire the guys, and invoice. I source my men through a guy named Aldo, who runs a crew call out of a parking lot south of Borman Expressway. They're hard workers, cash-in-hand folk who show up at 6 in the morning and don't ask questions. Since they're non-union, there's no insurance or safety certifications, which is fine with me since certifications cost money, and the kind of men Aldo supplies don't have social security numbers anyway. With Aldo's men, I underbid legitimate contractors by 40%. That's the margin. And business is good. The Murphy's meatpacking plant sat on a 4-acre lot on the south side of Gary, about a mile east of the rail yards where the freight trains stack up overnight. It stood 2 stories tall, made of brick and concrete, flat-roofed, built in the late 40s when Gary was still Gary. Steel mills running, population growing, the whole machine humming. The plant processed cattle for 30-something years, closed in 2003 when the parent company folded, and had been sitting empty ever since. 20 years of nothing. The city wanted the site cleared. Redevelopment was the word they used. The funding was probably federal. I could only imagine the timeline was imaginary. But the demolition contract was real, the money was real, and my bid was the lowest. The survey photos made the plant look manageable. The site report mentioned asbestos in the roof tiles, which my bid conveniently didn't address. The inspector would check for abatement compliance at the final walkthrough. By then, the tiles would be in a skip under 6 tons of rubble that nobody was going to sift through. I hired 4 men. Frank was mid-40s, stocky, had worked with me 3 times before. He knew the corners I cut, and he showed up anyway, because Frank had a wife and 3 kids, and demolition work in the spring was steady. He showed up, did the job, took the cash, and went home. Derek and Edgar were younger, early 20s, referred through Aldo's call. I didn't know which one was which for the first hour. They were both slight, quiet, and wearing the same brand of work boots that were already falling apart at the sole. Edgar, the one on the left I decided, asked me about hard hats when they arrived. I told them they were in the truck. I didn't get them. Thomas was Polish, barely spoke English, built like a shipping container. He showed up, I pointed at things, and he demolished them. I didn't know how to pronounce his surname, and I didn't try. I knew Frank's name because Frank was useful. The others were you or hey. I didn't need more than that. Day 1, we arrived at 7. The plant was bigger in person than the photos suggested. The perimeter fence was down in sections, the chain link peeled back and curled, as if something had pushed through from inside. The parking lot was cracked through with weeds, the aggressive kind, ones that split concrete. The building itself was intact. That was the first thing I noticed. 20 years derelict, and the walls were still straight, the roof still flat, the brickwork uncrumbled. In Gary, that's unusual. Empty buildings here get stripped by scrapers within months, copper piping, wiring, anything metal. But the plant looked untouched. The windows were boarded from the inside, the loading dock doors were rusted shut, the main entrance had a padlock on it that took Frank 3 minutes with bolt cutters. The smell hit us when the door opened. A seep, low and constant, one that gets in your sinuses and stays. Somewhere between chemical and organic. Ammonia maybe. Old blood. 20 years of whatever had soaked into the floors of a place that killed and cut and processed cattle for 3 decades, still breathing through the brickwork. The concrete remembered what it absorbed. Edgar pulled his shirt over his mouth. Thomas walked straight in without reacting. I stayed outside, directed from the parking lot. It was a standard first day. We stripped the corrugated cladding from the upper story and the exterior panels, each the size of a garage door. Frank and Derek worked the bolts with impact drivers, while Edgar and Thomas stacked the panels on the lot. I ran the rented excavator for the sections that wouldn't come free. A Cat 320 I'd picked up half price because the hydraulic arm had a slow leak and the rental company wanted it off their books. It worked fine if you didn't push it. I pushed it anyway. I watched from the cab. The crew worked below me. 4 men on a brick ledge 2 stories up. No harnesses or safety line. Derek was leaning out over the edge to reach a bolt. His boots caught on a ledge that was 18 inches wide and crumbling. I didn't say anything. If something looks dangerous, I tell the crew to handle it. That's the phrase I use. Handle it. It means the risk is yours, the assessment is yours, the consequence is yours. I'm at the perimeter with a coffee. My job is the contract. Your job is everything between signing and finishing. 3 years ago, a man died on one of my jobs. Site in Portage. It was a commercial building, concrete block construction. The wall needed temporary shoring before we could take down the adjacent section. Shoring costs time, and time costs money. I told the crew to handle it. They didn't shore it. The wall came down. A man was under it. He was undocumented, no next of kin on file, no insurance to process. I found his family through Aldo. I paid them $8,000 in cash. I didn't negotiate it. I picked a number and I paid it, and the family took it, because what else were they going to do? I tell myself it was a one-off. The guy should have been more careful. The risks are understood. Nearing the end of day 1, the upper cladding was stripped. The panels stacked, the skip half full. Good progress. The crew was packing tools into the back of my truck when Frank came over. He had his gloves off. He was flexing his hands, something you do after 8 hours of impact driving, when the vibration has settled into your joints and won't let go. The plans say 1 basement level, he said. Yeah. I was working by the loading dock this afternoon. The floor was vibrating. It's Gary, Frank. The whole city's built on swamp. Everything vibrates. Not like this. He shook his head. Like machinery running. The plant's been dead for 20 years. There's no machinery. I know. He looked at the building. The late afternoon light caught the brickwork, turning it the colour of dried blood. The boarded windows stared back at us. If you stood still long enough, if the wind dropped, you could almost hear something. Something low, like the building was breathing. Water table, I said. That's all. Frank looked at me, then at the building. He didn't argue. He never argued. That's why I kept hiring him. I stood in the parking lot and looked at the plant. The smell was still there. Faint, a chemical organic seep. I locked the gate, drove home, ate dinner, went to bed. Day 1 was fine. Everything was fine. On the second day, we set up for another hard day of labour. The ground floor of the Murphy's plant was a single open space, about 12,000 square feet, divided by partition walls into processing zones. The equipment was still in place. Stainless steel tables bolted to the floor, drain channels cut into the concrete, the overhead rail system running the full length of the building on steel I-beams. The hooks were still hanging. Dozens of them, every 18 inches, curved steel dulled by 2 decades of dead air, dangling at head height. Some of them had material on them. A dark, calcium-like deposit, crusted and hard, built up layers around the curve of the hook, like something had dried there slowly, coat after coat, thickening over time. I didn't touch them. I told the crew to leave the rail system for now and focus on the partition walls. Get into the cold storage rooms, strip the insulation panels, pull the refrigeration units. The scrap value on the steel will cover the excavator rental. Frank and Derek took the far wall. Sledgehammers. The partition was standard plasterboard over brick. The plaster came away in sheets. One swing went through. The sledgehammer head punched through the brick and kept going. Derek's arm followed it up to the elbows before he caught himself, stumbling forward, the handle wrenching in his grip. He pulled it back. The hole was about a foot across. The air that came through was warm. It moved through the hole in a steady current, like exhalation. It carried a smell different from the plant's usual chemical seep. Something organic, rawer than rot. The smell of a living interior, meat before it's meat, the inside of something. Frank stepped back from the hole. Derek was still holding the sledgehammer, staring at the gap where the warm air pushed through in slow, even pulses. They widened it, took out the surrounding bricks until the hole was big enough to see through, then big enough to step through. Behind the partition wall, where the cold storage room should have been, there was a concrete staircase. It led down. The stairs weren't on any plans. I'd studied the plans, not thoroughly, but enough to quote the job. The basement level was to the north, under the main processing floor. This was south under the loading dock, and he went deeper than a single basement level should. The stairs descended maybe 15 feet, turning once, and opened into what looked like a corridor. Concrete walls and floor, wider than it needed to be. The warm air rose from it in a steady updraft, carrying that raw interior smell. I shone my torch down. The beam reached the bottom of the stairs and into the corridor. I could see the walls. No paint or fixtures. The floor was clean, as if it had been maintained. The torch beam didn't reach the end. Frank, Derek, go down and check it out. Frank looked at me. Standard assessment. Check the extent. Check the walls for structural issues. See if there's asbestos. Report back. Frank looked at the stairs. The warm air moved past him, ruffling the collar of his jacket. Derek was standing behind him, still holding the sledgehammer, waiting for Frank to move first. I don't like the air, Frank said. It's a basement. Basements are warm. Not like this. Frank? I took a sip of my coffee. I'm not paying you to stand around. He looked at me for a long moment, the same look he'd given me at the end of day one, the look that said he knew exactly what I was, and showed up anyway, because money was money. He turned and went down the stairs. Derek followed. I stood by the hole and waited. 20 minutes. I checked my phone, scrolled through emails. The city inspector's office had sent a request for the abatement schedule, which I hadn't arranged for asbestos compliance. I forwarded it to myself and marked it unread. I'd deal with it next week. Deal with it never. Edgar and Thomas were still working the ground floor, pulling stainless steel tables from the floor bolts. The sound of their hammering echoed through the building, the natural arrhythmia of two men working at their own pace. The warm air from the hole pulsed, in and out, slow. I could feel it on my face when I stood close enough. A damp heat, like standing over a subway grate in summer. It shifted occasionally, the rhythm changing, speeding up for a few seconds and then settling back, like something adjusting. I finished my coffee. Then, Frank came up. He stepped through the hole calmly, tools in hand, face neutral. Derek was behind him, same pace and posture, same blank expression. They didn't look shaken nor relieved. They looked like two men stepping out of a room they'd been in 1,000 times before. They went back to work without a word. "Frank?" He stopped, turned. "What's down there?" "Nothing. Empty rooms. Goes back maybe 50 feet. He sounded off, because he sounded okay. After sending him to do something he didn't want to do, I'd be met with a sharp tone the rest of the day. The words came out even, no emphasis, like someone reading a line from a manual. "Anything structural?" "No." "Asbestos?" "No." "Good, we'll factor it into the schedule." He turned and walked back to the partition wall, picked up his sledgehammer and started swinging. Derek was already working. He'd gone straight to the wall without being told, picked up his hammer and started hitting the brickwork. Every impact landed at the same interval, same force, metronomic. I filed it, the way I file everything. Edgar's question about hard hats, Frank's comment about vibration, the asbestos in the roof tiles. I filed things. I note them and put them in a place where they don't interfere with the contract. That's management. I went back to the truck. From the cab, I could see through the plant's missing wall into the ground floor. All four of them were working. The sound reached me through the windscreen. They were working harder than I'd ever seen them. No breaks or conversations, just the hammers rising and falling. But they weren't working where I told them to work. The city contract specified exterior in, start with a street-facing elevation, clear the access route, open the site for the heavy machinery that would come in week 2. That was what I quoted. The crew wasn't demolishing outward. They were demolishing inward. Every swing was aimed toward the sub-basement, the hole in the partition wall. The one Frank and Derek had come back through 20 minutes ago was twice as big as it had been. The surrounding brickwork was coming down in sections, each impact removing a specific portion, widening the opening with an efficiency that looked almost architectural. They were opening it up. I sat in the cab and watched 4 men I was paying $12 an hour reshape a derelict meatpacking plant around a hole in the ground that wasn't on any plan. I should have gone in, should have pulled them off the wall, redirected the work, reasserted the schedule. I didn't. They were working hard and fast, and they weren't complaining. And for $12 an hour, that's all I'd ever ask of anyone. I took another sip of coffee and watched. The crew was working hard. That was the thing I kept coming back to. And they were working fast, working without breaks. In 26 years of demolition, I'd never seen a crew maintain that pace for more than an hour. These 4 hadn't stopped since Frank and Derek came up from the sub-basement. They were quiet, but some days were like that. Some crews never talk. You put 4 men together who don't share a language and the job gets done in silence. But the direction of the demolition was still wrong. They were still working inward, toward the sub-basement, but I could correct that tomorrow. People swing where the wall gives. The crew finds a section of brickwork that comes apart easily, and they keep going because momentum is momentum. It's physics, I rationalized. I went through the routine, checked the skip levels, running ahead of schedule, which meant I'd need a second skip by Thursday. Logged the tonnage in the notebook I kept in the glove box, called the city inspector's office. Yeah, we're gonna need to push the site visit back a week. We found a sub-basement that wasn't on the plans. Need to assess it before we can give you an accurate completion date. The inspector asked about the abatement schedule, the asbestos. In progress, I said. Specialist teams coming next week. There was no specialist team. The asbestos tiles were already in the skip under a quarter-ton of plaster and brick. By the time anyone checked, they'd be in a landfill in Porter County. The inspector said fine, pushed the visit to the following Friday. I thanked him, hung up. I needed the extra week, not for the sub-basement, for the safety equipment. If an inspector walked onto the site right now, he'd see 4 men doing heavy demolition with no hard hats, no high-vis, no harnesses, and no dust masks rated for the particulate they were breathing. He'd shut us down in 10 minutes. The extra week bought me time to stage the equipment, scatter it around the site, make it look used. The hard hats would be removed from the plastic wrap the day before the visit. I went back to check on Frank. He was working the south wall, the same metronomic swing I'd noticed in Derek, same impact at the same interval. I stood behind him and waited for him to notice me. But he didn't. Just kept swinging. Frank? He stopped, turned. The sledgehammer hung at his side. His face was neutral, not focused, just the surface. The sub-basement. How far does it actually go? Approximately 50 feet, single corridor, 4 rooms branching east. Structural condition? Intact, poured concrete, no visible degradation. Asbestos? Non-visible. Every answer was the same, delivered at the same pitch, the same flat register. No thinking, like reading off a spec sheet. I'd worked with Frank before, a man who gave you more than you asked for because he paid attention and had opinions. He'd tell you the load-bearing wall was in the wrong place, tell you the architect was an idiot. He'd tell you when something wasn't safe, and you could choose to listen to him or not. But he'd tell you. This wasn't Frank talking. This was something that wore Frank's voice out. You feeling alright? Yes. His face didn't change. His eyes were on me, fixed, impossible to miss. No micro movements, no shifting, just 2 points aimed at my face and nothing behind them. Good, I said. Keep at it. I walked away. The gas station was 2 blocks east on Madison Street. The walk was ordinary. Cracked sidewalks, dead lots, the particular emptiness of South Gary where the buildings outnumber the people 3 to 1. The gas station was a BP with a food counter. I bought a sandwich and a large coffee. The woman behind the counter was in her 60s, heavyset, reading a magazine she didn't look up from until I put the money down. You working the old plant? Yeah. Murphy's. She said it the way you say the name of someone you knew and didn't like. My uncle worked there, processing floor, 22 years till they closed it. Long time. People didn't like that place, even when it was running. She gave me my change. There was a part they didn't use, a lower section. My uncle said they sealed it off in the 70s before he started. Something about the original building. Whatever was there before the plant went up. Said the company poured concrete over it and pretended it wasn't there. I took my coffee. Probably just the original foundation. Probably. She went back to her magazine. I walked out. I filed it the way I file everything, somewhere behind the asbestos and the inspector, in the growing archive of things I decided were not my problem. I came back to the site, unwrapped my sandwich, and leaned against the truck. The crew hadn't stopped. 6 straight hours of heavy demolition without food, without water, or sitting down. I'd never seen it. The human body doesn't work like that. You hit a wall at hour 3, grip weakening. The hammer gets heavier with every swing. You take 5. They hadn't taken 5 once. The sub-basement entrance was 3 times the size it had been in the morning. The opening gaped in the south wall, the warm air pouring through in a steady current, and the 4 of them were still widening it, still working inward, swinging in that perfect rhythm. I was chewing my sandwich when I saw Edgar's arm. He was swinging left-handed. His right forearm was open, a gash running from elbow to wrist. The blood had run down to his hand, over his fingers, onto the sledgehammer handle. The grip was slick with it. Every time he swung, the hammer twisted slightly in his wet grip, and he corrected without flinching. I stood there with my sandwich and my coffee, and I watched the man bleed and work, and I did the calculation. Stopping Edgar meant pulling him off the wall. Pulling him off the wall meant driving him to urgent care in Merrillville, which was 40 minutes each way. That was an hour and a half of lost time, plus the rest of the afternoon if he couldn't come back. 1 man down meant the schedule slipped. The schedule slipping meant the inspector visit couldn't be pushed again. The inspector's visit meant the site had to be shut down. So, I didn't stop Edgar. I'd seen lesser men carry on working with broken fingers. If it wasn't bothering him, it wasn't an issue. I finished my sandwich. The sub-basement entrance kept growing, and somewhere underneath the calculation, something stirred that I didn't look at directly. The sub-basement wanted the building opened. The crew was the tool. Edgar's arm was damaged to the tool, and the damage was acceptable, because the work was continuing, and the work was all that mattered. It was my logic, exactly my logic, the same arithmetic I'd been running for 26 years. The cost of a man weighed against the cost of delay, and the man losing every time. Something beneath this building was running the same equation. I didn't think about that for long. I went back to my coffee. The hammering stopped. A hard stop. Just 4 sledgehammers hitting the concrete floor at the same instant, the sound ringing off the brickwork and out through the stripped walls. Then, nothing. I looked up from my phone. Through the gap in the exterior wall, I could see the ground floor. All 4 of them were standing still, hammers at the sides, arms loose. They were facing the sub-basement entrance, shoulder to shoulder, looking like they were waiting for something to start. I put my phone down, opened the truck door. Then, they walked. Frank first. He stepped forward without hesitation. Just a man walking toward a hole in the wall at a steady and deliberate pace, matched by Derek behind him, then Edgar, then Thomas. 4 men walking in step, and I don't mean roughly, precisely. Heel toe, every footfall landing at the same fraction of a second. Edgar's right arm hung at his side. The gash was crusted black from elbow to wrist. He hadn't cleaned it. The dried blood cracked along the edges as his arm swung with each step. They didn't go down empty-handed. Frank grabbed the scaffolding poles on his way past. 2 of them. He carried them one-handed without breaking stride. Derek took the portable floodlights. Edgar collected the extension cables, looping them over his shoulder with his good arm. Thomas took the tools, sledgehammers, pry bars, the impact drivers, all of it gathered into his arms like firewood. They stripped the ground floor the way they stripped a wall. Systematic. Everything that wasn't bolted to the structure was picked up and carried toward the stairs. The portable generator went last. Thomas came back for it last, picked it up by both handles, 80 pounds of steel and motor, and carried it down the stairs without adjusting his grip. 3 minutes, maybe 4. Then the ground floor was empty. The warm air from the sub-basement entrance shifted, thicker, pulsing in long, wet exhalations that I could feel from the truck. I got out, crossed the parking lot, walked through the gap in the exterior wall where the cladding used to be. The ground floor looked like something had died in it. The inward demolition had gutted the load-bearing structure along the south wall. Without the crew working to maintain the controlled opening, a steel I-beam had dropped across the main entrance, dragging a cascade of brickwork with it. The doorway was buried. 1.5 tons of steel and brick piled in the frame like something had coughed it up. I went to the loading dock. The rolling doors were rusted shut. They'd been like that since we'd arrived, but now a section of the upper floor had collapsed across them. Concrete slab, rebar poking through like broken bones, piled waist-high against the corrugated steel. The demolition had taken out whatever was holding that section up, and gravity had done the rest. The exterior gap where we'd stripped the cladding on day 1, the opening in the upper wall that we'd been using for access, was 20 feet off the ground. The scaffolding was gone. The crew had carried it below while I was away. I was halfway across the ground floor when I heard something. A groan from above. Structural, steel under stress. I looked up. The upper wall on the east side, the section directly above the cladding gap I'd walked through, was moving. A slow, inevitable lean, the brickwork separating from the steel frame in a cascade that started with a single crack and became a roar. I ran away. Behind me, the wall came down. The noise was enormous. Brick, steel and concrete slab hitting the ground floor in a single, compressed impact that shook the building under my feet. I turned around. The opening I'd come through 10 seconds ago was gone, buried under a ton of upper wall, dust still settling in the grey light. I stood there, coughing and waiting for the building to stop moving. I stood on the ground floor and turned in a slow circle. Every exit was blocked. An engineer would have seen this coming. A structural surveyor would have flagged it on day 1. Anyone with a basic understanding of how buildings stay upright would have known that if you tear out the south wall without bracing the north, the thing in between is going to drop. But I hadn't hired an engineer. I'd hired 4 men with sledgehammers and told them to swing. The only clear path was the sub-basement stairs. The stairwell glowed. That was new. The pale light, a bioluminescence that pulsed from below in slow, rhythmic waves, casting the staircase in a light that wasn't natural. It rose and fell in time with something I could feel through my boots, rising through the concrete slab into my legs, hips, chest. The frequency of something enormous and patient, running underneath everything like a second heartbeat. The sub-basement was active. Whatever my crew had been opening up for the last 12 hours was awake. Warm, wet air that pushed up through the stairwell stronger than ever. And 4 men were down there. Men I'd hired because they were cheap, whose surnames I mostly didn't know, families I couldn't contact. Their existence wasn't recorded in any system. I'd built this operation to be invisible, because the whole point was that nothing was supposed to go wrong in a way that anyone official could see. That invisibility was supposed to protect me. Now, it protected whatever had them. No one was coming, because I'd made sure, carefully, over 26 years of cutting corners and shaving margins, that the men I'd hired existed in no system that would notice their absence. I'd built the perfect trap. I just hadn't known I was building it around myself. I sat down, back against the wall. The concrete was cold through my jacket. The pale light still pulsed from the stairwell across the floor, shadows stretching in that slow, organic rhythm. I waited. For what? I don't know. For the rubble to clear itself. Maybe I could find a way up onto the second floor, out through a window, down to the parking lot and into the truck. A way. That was my word my brain kept reaching for. The way it reached for it 3 years ago in Portage, when a wall fell on a man, and the first thing I calculated wasn't how to help him, but how to leave. The light changed. Afternoon bled to grey, then grey bled to dark. I watched it happen through the stripped upper wall, the sky going from low cloud to iron to black. The temperature dropped with it. The concrete walls held no heat. The wind came through the gaps in the brickwork, the gaps my crew had made. I pulled my jacket tighter, but it didn't help. The pulse never stopped. I could feel it in my teeth. My phone worked. I pulled it out around 6. Full signal. I scrolled through my contact list, but stopped. Who was I going to call? The police? And tell them what? That 4 men walked into a basement and didn't come back? I'm trapped in a building I was hired to demolish? The first question would be about the crew. Names, documents, employment records, insurance. The second question would be about the permits. The third would be about the asbestos. And somewhere around question 4 or 5, the conversation would stop being a rescue operation and start being a criminal investigation. The moment I called anyone, the entire operation would be exposed. One phone call, and it all burns. I thought about Aldo, who supplied the crews, but Aldo doesn't come to sites. That's our arrangement. He supplies the bodies. What happens after that is my problem. Then I thought about calling my wife, Sandra. But what would I say? I'd have to explain. Not just tonight, all of it. She knows some of it. She doesn't know enough. I put the phone away. I did the calculation. I'd been avoiding it all afternoon. 4 men went down. They haven't come back. And they're not going to come back on their own. I could sit here until morning. That was the Ray Decker play. Play it out. Daylight would bring options. Let whatever was below finish what it was doing. Walk away in the morning and drive home. Call Aldo. Tell him the crew didn't show for day 3. Send him the cash in an envelope. Move on. I stood up. I want to say I went down because something changed in me. I felt guilt or responsibility, some late arriving conscience that rewired 26 years in a single moment against the wall. I didn't. I went down because I couldn't sit still. The warm air rose to meet me. The air was wet on my face. I took the first step and went down. The corridor was not 50 feet like Frank had said, but Frank had stopped being Frank somewhere between the bottom of those stairs and the top, and the thing that came back wearing his voice had lied. The corridor went on. My phone torch cut a thin beam through the dark, the light struggling against the air itself, which was thick, pressed against my face like a warm cloth. Every breath came heavy. The walls were coated. I saw it first as damp, a dark sheen on the concrete. I put my hand on the wall for balance as the floor sloped downward. It was warm, warmth that came from the wall itself, and when I pressed, it gave, slightly, like how skin gives over muscle. I pulled my hand back. A thin strand of material stretched between my palm and the wall before breaking. The pulse was stronger here. My phone vibrated in my hand in time with the rhythm, the case buzzing against my fingers. The whole corridor was a single system, contracting and expanding in slow, measured cycles. I was walking deeper into it with every step. I passed rooms. The cold storage, the original concrete boxes where they'd hung carcasses in the 60s and 70s. The heavy doors stood open, rusted at the hinges. And inside, the walls had changed. The dark growth covered every surface, a continuous layer of organic material, slick and dense, pulsing faintly in the bioluminescent glow. The rooms had been repurposed. The surfaces had grown into shapes, into structures, configurations that suggested function without revealing it. One room had a mass in the center, waist-high, flat-topped, the surface smooth. It could have been a table, if tables were grown from compacted tissue. Grooves ran from its edges to channels in the floor, angled downward toward a drain that wasn't a drain. Another room had protrusions from the ceiling. They hung at regular intervals, evenly spaced, curved at the end, like hooks on a rail. I stood in the doorway and looked at them. 18 inches apart, the same spaces as the hooks upstairs, the ones still hanging from the overhead rail on the ground floor. I kept walking. The corridor opened. The space beyond was large, cathedral large. The ceiling was 30 feet overhead, supported by columns of the same organic material. These thick, dark pillars rose from the floor and merged with the ceiling in smooth, continuous curves. The pale light came from the walls themselves, a cold bioluminescence that pulsed in time with a heartbeat, illuminating the chamber in slow, rhythmic waves. And the layout was the same. I recognized it before I understood it. The spatial arrangement, the flow from one end to the other, the positioning of the stations, the channels in the floor. It was the ground floor above me, the same processing line, intake at one end, stations in the middle, output at the far wall. The overhead rail system was replicated in organic form. Dark ridges ran the length of the ceiling, parallel lines evenly spaced with hooks of hardened growth hanging at 18-inch intervals. The stainless steel tables had become slabs of dense tissue arranged in rows, grooves on the surface angled toward the central collection points. The drain channels were carved into the living floor, converging at the far end of the chamber. It was a mirror. The plant above, rebuilt in meat. Whatever had been growing beneath this building since before the plant was constructed had looked up at what the humans built and understood it as process, input, conversion, and output, the systematic reduction of living things into material. And it had built its own version, using the template above as a blueprint. The meatpacking plant had processed cattle for 30 years. The sub-basement had been learning the whole time. My crew was inside the system. I saw Frank first. He was near the intake end, the first station in the line. Standing upright, motionless, his body partially embedded in the organic growth. It had climbed his legs to the thigh, encasing them in a shell of dark material, fusing him to the floor like how a post is set in concrete. His arms were still free, his hands hung at his sides, his eyes were open. But his face was blank, real blankness, the total absence of expression that comes when whatever was producing the expressions isn't there anymore. Derek was further along, the next station. More of him was covered. The growth had reached his torso, wrapping around his chest in thick bands, and his arms were extended outward, held in position by tendrils of the material. His hands were gripping tools, a pry bar, a hammer. Still, the tools had been absorbed into the structure, the handles fused with the organic growth, metal and tissue merging into a single surface. He wasn't building anymore. He was being built into. Edgar was near the center, the processing stations. His injured arm, the gash I'd watched bleed for 3 hours, was completely covered. The growth had entered the wound, filled it, and spread from it. The organic material was thickest where his blood had met the air, as if the opening in his skin had been an invitation, a point of entry, and the system had accepted. Thomas was at the far end, nearly gone. The growth had reached his neck. His body below it was a shape under the surface, the outline of a man beneath a layer of dark tissue, like a body under a sheet. Only his face was still exposed, that same blank expression, eyes open. And somewhere behind the blankness, somewhere in there, might have been a person 12 hours ago. They were still being processed, station by station, the same sequence the plant above had used on cattle, applied to 4 men who had walked down a flight of stairs because their foreman had told them to assess the structural condition. I sent them here. I pointed to the stairs and said, "I'm not paying you to stand around." Tried to get a reaction, but they didn't react. I stood in the chamber. The pulse beat through the floor, through my boots. The pale light cycled. The system working around me. It didn't acknowledge me. I was not part of the process. I was standing in a slaughterhouse, watching the line run. The way I'd always stood. At a distance. I walked to Frank. It wasn't because I'm brave. I want to be clear about that. I walked to Frank because he was the closest. His eyes were open, and something in them was still looking at me. The look that said, "I know exactly what you are," and I showed up anyway, because the money is money, and you are the cost of earning it. I grabbed his arm, both hands above the elbow where the growth hadn't reached. I pulled. The organic material resisted. His legs were fused to the floor. The shell around them was thick and fibrous, bonded to the surface in a root system I could feel through the tension in his body. I pulled harder, planted my boots and leaned back, put my weight into it. Nothing. He didn't move. The growth held him. I let go, went to Derek, grabbed the tendrils around his chest and tore at them with my fingers. The material was warm, with a texture somewhere between rubber and wet wood. It gave slightly under my nails, but didn't break. I tore harder. My fingers just slipped on the slick surface. I went to Edgar. His station was more integrated than the others, with growth connecting his position to those on either side in a network of dark ridges, like veins. I grabbed one of the ridges and wrenched sideways. something tore. Not the growth around Edgar. Something underneath. A structural connection. A ridge of organic material that linked his station to the adjacent one. A small tear, just a few inches. But something in the system reacted. The pulse changed, faster and irregular, breaking for the first time since I'd entered the sub-basement. The steady, patient heartbeat stuttered, skipped, and the growth around Edgar's station contracted, pulling tighter, cinching inward, as if the system was shoring itself up against the damage. The floor under my boots went slick, unstable. The surface that had been firm a moment ago became wet and mobile, and my right foot slid out from under me. I stumbled sideways into one of the organic columns. I felt it flex under my weight, the whole pillar bending before springing back. Something above me groaned. I looked up. One of the overhead ridges, the organic rail, the grown replica of the steel system upstairs, was cracking. The growth along its length was splitting, the bioluminescent surface fracturing, and a section dropped. It missed me by inches. A mass of dark tissue the size of a car door slammed into the floor beside me, splattering warm residue across my legs. The moment it hit the surface, it began dissolving, sinking into the floor, being reabsorbed, the system reclaiming its own material. The system was rejecting me, like a machine ejects a blockage, the way a processing line identifies an obstruction and shunts it clear. I was the malfunction, a piece of debris caught in the mechanism, and the mechanism was pushing me out. The floor tilted slightly, a few degrees. The slick surface under my feet became a slope, angled toward the corridor, back toward the stairs, to the only path in the chamber that was still bare concrete. The system was channeling me. I looked back at Frank. His eyes were still open, looking at me. Whatever was left of the man who knew my name, who worked my jobs, showed up at 6 in the morning and swung a hammer until I told him to stop. It was still there. Diminished, distant, but present. He was watching me leave. I reached for him one more time, but the floor heaved. The surface buckled, a wave rolling along the organic material, lifting me off my feet and throwing me backwards. I hit the ground, slid across a slick growth, and my back struck concrete. The corridor. The bare concrete of the corridor where the system ended and the building began. I scrambled, hands and knees, boots scraping, the warm air at my back now pushing me out. The air pressure changed, a steady wind blowing up the corridor toward the stairs, and I ran with it. Up the corridor, the bioluminescent glow fading with every step, the pulse growing fainter, the rhythm settling back to its slow, steady patience as the obstruction cleared the system. I reached the ground floor and turned around. The sub-basement entrance was closing. Dark tendrils of organic growth were reaching across the opening, floor to ceiling, thickening as I watched. They braided together, hardened, layered over each other in rapid strands. The warm air cut off, the glow dimmed. The growth sealed the gap in 30 seconds. A wall of dark organic material where the hole in the brickwork used to be, already crusting at the surface, drying to that same calcified deposit. The pulse faded to nothing. The air in the building went still. Cold. The night air rushed through the gaps in the brickwork, and the ground floor was just the ground floor again. The smell of old concrete. The entrance was gone. My crew was below, and I couldn't get back in. I stood on the ground floor, breathing hard. My hands were slick with residue. The warm, organic film of whatever I'd been tearing at, drying in the cold air, tightening on my skin like a glove. I went down. For the first time in 26 years, I went to where the work was. I put my hands on a man and I pulled, tore at the thing that was eating my crew, and I tried to get them out. And it wasn't enough. Not because I wasn't strong enough, or because the system was too powerful, but because the system had 12 hours. 12 hours while I sat in my truck and checked my phone, drank my coffee and watched through the windscreen. 12 hours of integration, of slow conversion. By the time I put my hands on Frank, there was nothing left to pull free. 4 men went into a sub-basement because I pointed at the stairs and said, "I'm not paying you to stand around," and I sat in the truck for 12 hours. Then, it was too late. The delay between the damage and the response, the gap between the thing I caused and the moment I showed up. That's who I am. Not the man who doesn't go down, the man who goes down too late. And that's the thing I'll carry. Dawn came the way it comes in Gary, slow and grey. I was sitting on the ground floor with my back against the sealed wall when the light crept through the gaps in the brickwork. I hadn't slept. I'd sat against that wall for 5 hours, the cold settling into my joints, and I'd stared at the place where the sub-basement entrance used to be. It was smooth now. The organic material had completely crusted over. If you didn't know, you'd walk past it, think it was old concrete or bad plaster, a patch job from the 70s. The pulse was gone. The building was still. I found a way out in the daylight. The upper floor on the east side had partially collapsed inward, forming a slope I could climb. Unstable, the kind of thing I'd have told my crew to handle and stayed clear of myself. I climbed it, cut my palm on a piece of rebar, reached the second floor, crossed to a window that had lost its boarding, and looked out at the parking lot 20 feet below. I jumped. Landed badly, my ankle folded and pain shot up my leg. I sat in the lot for a minute, breathing, my hands on the cracked tarmac. The truck was where I'd left it. I limped to it, got in and turned the key. I drove. Not home. I drove through Gary in the early light, past the rail yards, shuttered storefronts on Broadway, the gas station on Madison, where a woman had told me about a lower level sealed off in the 70s. I drove to the parking lot south of Borman. Aldo was there. He was always there. At 6 in the morning, in a white van, a thermos of coffee on the dashboard. He was leaning against the driver's side door when I pulled in, talking to a man I didn't recognize. The man walked away when he saw my truck. Aldo looked at me. I must have looked like something. I hadn't slept. My jacket was stained with residue. My hands were crusted with it. My right palm was bleeding through a dirty cut. "Ray," he said, "you all right?" I reached across to the glove box, opened it. The envelope was inside. 4 payments, cash, 2 days of work at $12 an hour. I counted it on the Sunday night, labeled it in the way I always labeled them, first names only. I held it out. Aldo took the envelope and opened it, looked at the cash, the labels. Frank, Derek, Edgar, Thomas. What families? I stared at him. I mean, where do I find them? You got addresses, numbers? I didn't. I had 4 first names. I knew Frank had a wife, or thought he did. He'd mentioned her once, maybe twice in passing, on a site in Portage or Merrillville, between swings. I didn't know her name. I didn't know where they lived. If Derek or Edgar had anyone, not a single thing about Thomas beyond the fact that he was Polish and strong. I wouldn't be able to find a single person in the world who was waiting for them to come home. "Ask around," I said. Aldo looked at the cash and looked at me. His face did something I hadn't seen from him before. Wariness. The look of a man who has been in the business of supplying disposable people long enough to recognize when one of them has been disposed of. "I'll ask around," he said. His tone said he wouldn't. All I could do was drive away. I drove back to the plant. The ground floor was visible through the stripped wall. If I called the city tomorrow, told them the site had structural issues, and said I was pulling out, they'd send another contractor with another crew. The new contractor would look at the plans, see one basement level, and never know about the second. They'd demolish the ground floor, hit the sealed wall, and think it was foundation. They'd build over it. Or they'd break through, and whatever was down there would be waiting. The system intact, the line ready to run. I should call someone, the city or the EPA, someone with the authority to condemn the site, seal it, someone who could make sure no one else went down those stairs. I picked up my phone and did the same calculation as before. If I called, they'd come. They'd ask about the crew. They'd find no records. They'd find asbestos in the skip. They'd find a man in Portage, if they looked hard enough, buried under paperwork that doesn't exist and a cash payment that went nowhere. Everything I'd built for 26 years. Gone. I drove home. Sandra was getting ready for work. She looked at me when I came in. The stained jacket, the cut, a face that hadn't slept, and asked what happened. "Long job," I said. "Ran late." She looked at me the way Aldo had looked at me. The wariness, the sense that the answer she'd been given wasn't the answer she'd asked for. She didn't push. She never did. That's the arrangement. I come home, I give her numbers, and she doesn't ask what the numbers are built on. The same arrangement I have with everyone. I stood in the kitchen and watched her pour coffee and thought about Frank's wife, the woman whose name I never learned, who would wait tonight and tomorrow night and the night after that for a man who wasn't coming home. And she'd call Aldo eventually. Aldo would say he'd ask around, and nobody would, because no one had a surname or an address. Frank would just stop existing. Without a record, no system that notices the gap. Sandra left for work. I heard a car pull out of the drive. I sat at the kitchen table. I'd given a hopeful envelope to Aldo, 4 payments for 4 men. That was how I settled things. A transaction, the machinery of consequence, handled the way I handled everything. Except, I'd looked. I'd stood in that chamber. I'd looked at Frank, and Frank had looked back. I thought about the next contractor, the next set of men who'd show up at 6 in the morning and not ask questions. I should make the call. I picked up my phone. I put it down. I picked it up and put it down again. I'll make the call. That's what I tell myself, sitting at the kitchen table. I'll report the site, take what comes, the investigation, the charges, 26 years of invisible operations dragged into the light. I'll do it. Tomorrow, not today. Today I need to think, need to figure out how to say what needs to be said without saying everything. Today, I need to manage it. That's the word I use. Manage. The morning passes, the phone sits on the table. I don't pick it up.